The morning Opal Keene rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a borrowed mule with a split lip and a carpetbag holding everything she owned in this world. She told herself she was not running away. She was simply choosing a direction that happened to be away from her father's ranch, and every cruel word he had ever pressed into her like a brand. It was the spring of 1883, and the cattle drives were still pushing through Caldwell on their long march up from Texas, and the town smelled of dust and livestock and possibility, which was more than she could say for the Keene property 20 miles east, where the only thing that had ever grown with any abundance was her father's bitterness. Her name was Opal Keene, and she was 23 years old, and she had a scar along her left palm from a fence wire accident when she was 9, and she had green eyes that her mother, God rest her, had called the color of shallow creek water in July. She had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's stubbornness, and as her father had reminded her constantly since her mother passed 6 years prior, absolutely none of the qualities that would make her worth a damn to anyone. Those were his words. Delivered on a Tuesday in March, the week she had finally packed that carpetbag, worth a damn to anyone. She had stood in the kitchen of the house where she had been born, holding a bread loaf she had pulled from the oven, and her father, Clement Keene, had walked in smelling of last night's whiskey and last year's failures, and he had looked at her the way a man looks at furniture he has grown tired of, and he had said, "You know, your mother was at least pretty enough to make a man overlook her uselessness. I don't know what you've got going for you, Opal. You're about as worthless as they come." She had set the bread down carefully so as not to drop it. She had untied her apron. She had folded it over the back of the chair where her mother used to sit. And the next morning before dawn she had bridled the old mule that technically belonged to their neighbor, Harlan Price, who had told her a dozen times she was welcome to use it whenever she needed, and she had ridden west toward Caldwell without looking back once. Not because she wasn't tempted to look back, but because she knew that if she did, something in her would crack open, and she could not afford that right now. Caldwell in the spring of 1883 was a loud, ambitious, slightly dangerous place. The Santa Fe Trail had brought commerce, and the cattle trade had brought money, and money had brought gambling houses and saloons and hotels of varying respectability, and also a newspaper, a church, 2 dry goods stores, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Greer Pollitt who charged fair rates and asked reasonable questions. Opal found Mrs. Pollitt's boarding house by asking a woman at the dry goods counter, and she arrived at the 2-story white building on Kisham Street with exactly $1.40 in her pocket, and the kind of dignity that exists only in people who have decided they have nothing left to prove to anybody. Mrs. Pollitt was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and spectacles she wore pushed up on her forehead like she kept forgetting they were there. She looked Opal over the way a practical woman assesses a situation, which is to say thoroughly and without meanness. "You look like you've had a hard few days," Mrs. Pollitt said. "A hard few years," Opal said honestly. Mrs. Pollitt nodded as though that was a satisfactory answer. "I charge $2 a week, breakfast included. Supper costs extra unless you help me cook it, in which case we call it even. I don't allow men past the parlor. I don't allow drinking in the rooms. I allow crying as long as it's quiet." Opal almost smiled for the first time in a week. "That's a fair set of rules. Can you cook? Better than most. Can you start tonight? I can start right now." And that was how Opal Keene came to live in Caldwell, Kansas, sleeping in a clean room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street, cooking supper for Mrs. Pollitt's 6 boarders in exchange for lodging, and a small weekly wage that began to add up slowly and steadily towards something she hadn't yet given a name to. She worked hard, the way she had always worked hard, because that was what she knew. She kept her head down. She was polite to the boarders and warmer than polite to Mrs. Pollitt, who reminded her sometimes of her mother, not in looks but in the quiet competence with which she moved through a room. She listened to the town and let the town wash over her, and tried not to think too much about what her father had said. But of course she thought about it. She thought about it at night when the main street went quiet enough to hear the wind off the prairie. She thought about it in the kitchen at 4 in the morning when she was stirring cornmeal into the pot, and the day was still dark and full of silence. She thought about it with the particular exhausting persistence of a woman who has been told something so many times by someone who was supposed to love her that the lie has begun to feel like a fact. Worth a damn to anyone. Was she? She honestly was not sure anymore. The first time she saw Elijah Hale, it was at the weekly market on a Wednesday morning in early April, and he was arguing politely but firmly with a vendor over the price of seed corn. And the argument was so good-natured, and the vendor was laughing despite himself. And Opal thought, without meaning to, that this was a man who knew how to hold his ground without making the other person feel trampled. He was tall, with the kind of build that comes from actual physical labor rather than anything decorative, wide through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar because it needed cutting. He was maybe 30, she guessed, or close enough. He wore a working man's clothes, a canvas shirt the color of dried grass, denim trousers, boots that had seen serious use, a hat that had been rained on more than once and shaped by weather into something distinctly his own. She noticed him the way you notice a particular tree in a landscape, not because it is flashy but because it is solid, and the landscape makes more sense with it in the picture. She did not introduce herself. She bought her flour and her salt and her dried beans, and she went back to Mrs. Pollitt's boarding house and thought about the cornmeal mush that needed to be done before the boarders woke. But she saw him again on Thursday, this time at the livery stable where she was returning the mule to its actual owner, Harlan Price's cousin who kept horses in Caldwell. And the tall man was there examining a bay gelding with the kind of focused attention a serious horseman gives an animal he is considering trusting his life to. "That one favors his left front," Opal said before she could stop herself, because she had grown up on a ranch and she knew horses and the bay was standing slightly wrong and it seemed relevant. The man looked at her, not with surprise exactly, more with a kind of interested attention, like she had said something worth listening to. He looked at the horse's left front, crouched down, ran his hand along the leg with a practiced touch. "You're right," he said. He stood up. He looked at her again. "Thank you. It might be nothing," she said. "A stone bruise maybe, or it might be the beginning of something worth watching. I'll have the farrier take a look." "That's what I do," he nodded. He put out his hand. "Elijah Hale. I run a cattle ranch about 8 miles north of town." She shook his hand. His grip was honest. "Opal Keene. I cook at Mrs. Pollitt's boarding house. How long have you been in Caldwell?" "About 3 weeks. Where before that?" "East of here," she said, which was true enough to be an answer and vague enough to be private. He nodded again, and there was something in the nod that said he understood the difference between a person who doesn't want to talk about something and a person who is being evasive, and he respected the former without pressing. "The bay will stay here then," he said to the stable man. "I'll bring Caldwell's farrier by this afternoon." He tipped his hat to Opal and she nodded back, and she walked out of the livery stable and back down the main street toward the boarding house, and she was aware, in a peripheral and somewhat irritating way, that she was thinking about his eyes, which were gray-brown, the color of flint, and which had looked at her like she was a person worth looking at. She told herself this was not significant. She had enough on her mind without adding a rancher to the list. The weeks moved forward the way spring weeks do in Kansas, which is to say with energy and variable weather, warm days interspersed with cold snaps and sudden afternoon storms that came off the prairie with theatrical speed. Opal settled into the rhythm of Mrs. Pollitt's house and found that she was, to her own surprise, content in a way she had not expected. Not happy exactly, not yet, but steady, grounded, like a tree after a hard winter that has finally decided to put out new growth. She was good at the cooking, and she knew it, not with vanity but with the simple satisfaction of doing something well. The boarders complimented her regularly, and Mrs. Pollitt, who was not a woman given to excessive praise, told her one morning that her biscuits were the best she had tasted since her own mother's, which Opal recognized as the highest possible compliment from a woman like that. She also began, quietly, to look for other work. Not because she was unhappy with Mrs. Pollitt, but because she had a practical mind and she could see that cooking at a boarding house was a start and not a finish, and she had a growing, insistent idea that she wanted something of her own, though she hadn't yet worked out exactly what that meant. Caldwell had a small schoolhouse that ran classes 3 days a week with a teacher who was leaving in June for Wichita, and Opal learned this from the newspaper and presented herself to the town council with a letter she had written explaining her qualifications, which included 3 years of schooling beyond the ordinary and the ability to teach reading, arithmetic, basic geography, and composition. The council listened, and 2 of the 3 members told her politely that they would be advertising the position more formally and would review all applicants. The 3rd member, a man named Beaumont who owned the biggest saloon in Caldwell, told her that teaching school was an interesting ambition for a woman who showed up in town alone without a husband and without a reference, and that perhaps she ought to focus on what women were naturally suited for. She thanked him for his time in a tone that was glacially courteous and walked out. She told Mrs. Pollitt about it that evening in the kitchen, and Mrs. Pollitt said, without looking up from the beans she was sorting, "Beaumont is a man whose opinion of others rises and falls entirely based on whether he needs something from them. Don't let it settle in you." "It won't," Opal said, and she meant it. But she sat with it a little, the way you sit with a stone in your shoe, aware of it even when you're trying not to be. It was at the Caldwell General Merchants' monthly gathering, a casual social affair held in the back room of Morrison's Dry Goods on the first Saturday of each month, where property owners and business people in the area gathered to trade information and complain about weather and cattle prices, that she saw Elijah Hale again. He was standing near the window with a man she recognized as Tom Purdy, who ran the feed store, and they were talking with the focused ease of men who have known each other a long time. Opal was there at Mrs. Pollitt's request, picking up an order of spices that had finally arrived by freight wagon, and she was standing at the counter waiting when Elijah Hale saw her across the room and nodded in recognition. She nodded back. He excused himself from Tom Purdy and came over. "Miss Keene," he said. "Mr. Hale." "How's the bay?" she asked, because it was the obvious question and also because she genuinely wanted to know. He smiled. He had a good smile, the kind that involved his whole face rather than just the surface of it. "Stone bruise, exactly like you said. He's already 3/4 recovered. The farrier said whoever spotted it early saved the horse a great deal of trouble." "I'm glad." "You grew up around horses." "On a cattle ranch," she said, "east of here." He waited the same way he had at the livery stable, with a patience that invited more if she wanted to give it and did not demand if she didn't. She found herself, to her own surprise, giving a little more. "My father's ranch. I worked it with him for 6 years after my mother passed. I left in March." "I'm sorry about your mother. It's been 6 years." "Grief doesn't follow a schedule," he said, simply and without performance. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." The merchants' gathering swirled around them, voices and laughter and the smell of pipe smoke, and they stood near the counter and talked, first about horses and then about cattle, and then about the spring weather and the condition of the prairie grass this year. And it was the kind of conversation that looks like it is about practical things, but is actually about people getting to know each other, testing out whether the other person is who they seem to be. He asked about her application to the school board because word traveled fast in Caldwell, and she told him what had happened, including Beaumont's comment, and she watched his face carefully as she told it, because a man's reaction to that kind of story tells you something important. His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger at her, but with the kind of irritation a decent person feels when they hear about someone being treated unfairly. "Beaumont's an idiot," he said. "He's an idiot with a vote. she said. The other two, I think they were genuinely considering it. I haven't heard back. You should hear back. The town needs a school teacher who actually knows something. The last one they had spent more time complaining about the dust than teaching the children. She smiled at that. I am generally at peace with dust. A necessary quality out here. She walked back to Mrs. Pollitt's that evening with the spices under her arm and a lighter feeling in her chest than she had carried in a long time, and she recognized it with a slight wariness, the way you recognize warmth after you've been cold for a long time, grateful for it but a little uncertain, because you've forgotten what it costs. He came to Mrs. Pollitt's boarding house the following Tuesday, which surprised her. He came at the front door in the early afternoon and asked Mrs. Pollitt if Miss Keene was in, and Mrs. Pollitt came to find her in the kitchen with a particular expression on her face that contained a great deal of information without a single word. He was standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands, and he had clearly made an effort, his shirt clean, his hair combed, though still curling at the collar. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said. I'm just finishing the bread, she said. I can come back. No, it's all right. It just needs another hour to rise. Sit down if you like. He sat. She sat across from him, and there was a moment of the particular quiet that exists between two people who are figuring out what this is. I wanted to ask you something, he said, and I thought it was better to ask directly than to work up to it through several more conversations at the dry goods store. She appreciated this. All right. I have a ranch 8 miles north. It's not a small operation. I have 14 hands, and we run about 600 head of cattle. I also have a house that has been without anyone in it who actually manages it for about 4 years, since my housekeeper, Mrs. Conaway, went east to be near her daughter. I have made do, but I am increasingly aware that I am doing a poor job of it, and I am aware also that my hands eat my cooking only because they are contractually obligated to be present at mealtimes. She was smiling now in spite of herself. What are you asking? I'm asking if you would consider coming out to the ranch as my housekeeper. It would be proper work, with a proper wage and your own room in the house, and I want to be clear that I am asking this as a straightforward business arrangement, because I think you are a capable woman, and I think my ranch would benefit from having someone capable in it. Nothing more complicated than that. She studied him for a moment. He met her gaze without flinching or looking away, which she found she respected. What do you pay? She asked. He named a figure. It was more than she was earning at Mrs. Pollitt's, considerably more. I would want Sundays free, she said. Sundays are yours entirely. And I want it understood that I'm running the household as I see fit, not taking direction on every small decision. I would expect nothing less, he said. I have enough to manage with the cattle without also managing the kitchen. She thought about it for 2 days, which was the appropriate amount of time for a decision that was going to change the shape of her life. She talked it over with Mrs. Pollitt, who listened carefully and then said, Elijah Hale is a good man. I have known him 5 years. He is fair and he is honest, and he is not the kind of man who makes promises he doesn't keep. That's more than you can say for most. You're telling me to go, Opal said. I'm telling you the information I have, Mrs. Pollitt said, in the tone of a woman who respects another woman's ability to make up her own mind. The decision is yours, she went. The Hale Ranch in the spring of 1883 was a working ranch in the fullest and most demanding sense of that phrase. It sat on a broad sweep of tallgrass prairie north of Caldwell. The house, a solid 2-story structure of wood and stone that had been built to last rather than to impress, surrounded by outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and the particular organized clutter of a place where a great deal of actual work gets done every day. Elijah Hale showed her around on the afternoon she arrived, and she could see immediately what he had meant about the house. It was clean enough, in the way a man's house is clean when he is trying his best but doesn't quite know where to start, which is to say the important surfaces were clear, but the corners were dusty, and the kitchen was functional but joyless, and there were windows that hadn't been properly washed since what looked like the previous autumn. She didn't say any of this. She put her carpetbag in the room he showed her, which was on the second floor at the back of the house and had a window looking out over the prairie. And she came downstairs and made supper for 14 ranch hands and one ranch owner with the stores that were available, which were serviceable but not inspired. And everybody ate and nobody complained. And after supper, Elijah Hale helped her wash up because that was apparently what he did, and she found this unexpected and quietly notable. "You don't have to do that," she said. "There are 2 of us here in the evening," he said reasonably. "It goes faster with 2. She couldn't argue with the logic. The first month at the ranch was the month of discovery, of learning a place and letting the place learn you. She found her rhythm in the house the same way she had found it at Mrs. Pollitt's, confidently and practically, moving from room to room and task to task with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who has been managing a household since she was 15. She organized the kitchen into something that made sense. She got the windows clean. She sorted the storeroom and made a list of what was needed and gave it to Elijah, who looked it over and said, "Take the wagon on Wednesday and get whatever you need," which was exactly the kind of direct, uncomplicated trust she had asked for and was not entirely used to receiving. The hands were a varied group of men ranging from a couple in their early 20s to one older fellow named Gus who was maybe 55 and had been on the ranch since it was a smaller operation, and who regarded Opal with a careful, assessing warmth that suggested he had been waiting for the ranch to have some actual management for some time. "You make biscuits?" Gus asked her, on her 3rd morning. "I make excellent biscuits," she said. "Mrs. Conaway's biscuits were the best in the territory," he said, with the particular gravity of a man laying down a significant standard. "Then I'll just have to be better," she said. He showed up the following morning with a jar of wild prairie honey he had apparently been saving, and he put it on the table and said nothing, and she understood that this was a truce and possibly the beginning of something like respect. She also, as the weeks passed, began to understand Elijah Hale in the way you understand a place you are living in, by degrees and by the accumulation of small observations. He was up before dawn every day. He worked with his hands alongside his men rather than directing from a distance. He was direct in his speech and precise in his expectations, and completely without meanness. He listened when someone was talking to him, actually listened, rather than waiting for his own turn to speak, which was rarer than it should have been among people in general and among men in particular. He had a younger sister named Clara, who lived in Wichita and wrote letters that arrived every few weeks, and that he read carefully and replied to promptly. He had no parents living, his father having died of a fever 8 years ago and his mother the year after that, which was when he had taken over the ranch at 22. He had run it for 9 years and built it into what it currently was through a combination of hard work, good judgment, and the willingness to admit when he was wrong, which Opal observed directly one afternoon when he made a decision about moving the herd to a different section of grazing land, and then, having listened to Gus point out the water situation, changed his mind without embarrassment or defensiveness. She found this remarkable. She found this, if she was being honest with herself, more attractive than she was entirely comfortable with. She wrote her father no letters. She was not ready for that and was not sure she ever would be. She had her own life now, or the beginning of one, and she was tending it carefully the way you tend a new fire. The letter from the school board arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-May, delivered to her care of the Hale Ranch since she had updated her address. She read it in the kitchen with her morning coffee and then read it again because she wanted to be sure she was reading it correctly. 2 of the 3 council members had voted in her favor. She had the position. The school term would begin in September, teaching 3 days a week, with a modest salary that would supplement but not replace her income from the ranch. She sat with the letter for a long moment and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the specific quiet joy of something going right. She told Elijah at supper, setting the letter on the table beside his plate and waiting for him to read it. He read it and then he looked up at her, and his expression was the one she had come to recognize as his version of genuine pleasure, which was not exuberant but was deeply real. "Congratulations, Miss Keene," he said. "You're not worried about losing your housekeeper 3 days a week?" she asked. "You can manage this house and a classroom without anyone worrying about losing anything," he said. "I've watched you work. You could manage twice as much." She looked at her plate. The compliment landed somewhere soft, which meant she didn't quite know what to do with it, which was its own kind of information. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Also," he said, returning to his supper with the studied casualness of someone about to say something important, "I believe Beaumont had the vote go against him. I may have mentioned to one of the other council members that your apple pie at last month's church gathering was evidence enough of your general superiority." She stared at him. "You did not. I mentioned it. That is not a criterion for hiring a schoolteacher. It spoke to your character," he said, and his voice was perfectly even, but the corner of his mouth was doing something she had learned to watch for. She laughed, which surprised both of them slightly, because it was the first real, full laugh she had produced in company since she couldn't remember when, and it sounded different than she remembered, freer somehow. He was smiling, a full, genuine smile, and they looked at each other across the supper table in the spring lamplight, and something in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a door shifts when a wind changes direction outside. She thought about that moment for several days afterward. In June, her father arrived at the Hale ranch. She was in the vegetable garden at the side of the house, which she had planted in April, and which was coming along with the satisfying reliability of things that grow when given proper care, when she heard the wagon on the road, and she stood up and saw the old buckboard with the dun horse, and her stomach went cold. Clement Keene climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of a man who had been driving for some hours and who was probably not happy about it. He was 61 years old, with a face that had been weathered by sun and set by years of disappointment into something ungiving, and he walked across the yard toward her with the flat expression of a man who has rehearsed something. She did not go to meet him. She waited. "Opal," he said. "Father, you took Price's mule." "I returned it," she said. "3 weeks after I arrived in Caldwell, I sent him a note. That's not the point." "What is the point?" He looked around the ranch yard with the assessing look of a man who is recalibrating, taking in the size of the operation, the quality of the corrals, the well-maintained equipment, and she could see him running calculations she didn't particularly want to see him run. "You left without a word," he said. "I left a note," she said, "on the kitchen table." "A note?" "Yes." "You're my daughter," he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite read, anger certainly, but underneath it something else, some deeper, uglier thing that she recognized after a moment as shame, though she doubted he had the vocabulary for it. "I know that," she said. "But I am also an adult woman and I made a decision about my own life, and I don't owe you a different kind of departure than the one I gave you. You're working for some rancher," he said, "running his house. That's what you've chosen." "I'm also teaching school in September," she said, "and I'm managing this ranch's household, which is a position I applied for and was offered on the basis of my qualifications." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was high, and the prairie was green, and insects were working the vegetable garden behind her, and everything else in the world was going about its ordinary business, while they stood in this particular silence. "You always did take after your mother," he said, and she could not tell if it was a criticism or not, and she had been trying to tell for 23 years. "I'll take that," she said. He was about to say something else when she heard the back door of the house open and close, and Elijah Hale came around the corner of the house, not hurrying, not interfering, but present in the way that a man who has seen something from his window and decided to be available decides to be present. "This is Elijah Hale," Opal said. "He owns this ranch." Clement Keene shook his hand with the automatic reflex of a man who shakes hands as a matter of course, and Elijah shook it back with the same easy directness he brought to everything. "Clement Keene," her father said. "Opal's father." "I know," Elijah said. "She mentioned she had a father east of here. Can we offer you something to drink? It's a long drive from there." This was so smoothly ordinary that it diffused something briefly in the sharp air between them. Her father accepted water, and they stood for a few minutes in the yard in a conversation that was technically about the road conditions and the cattle market, but was actually about territory and intention. And she could see Elijah Hale being quietly, unmistakably clear that this was his ranch, and she was working here under his authority and not her father's, and he did it without raising his voice or making a single aggressive statement. Her father left an hour later. He said before climbing back on the buckboard, "I want you to come home." She said, gently but completely firmly, "No." He sat for a moment with the reins in his hands, and she thought she saw something move across his face, something too old and complicated to name, and then he clicked his tongue to the horse and the buckboard rolled away down the road, and she watched it go until it was out of sight. Elijah came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you for coming out," she said. "I didn't want to intrude," he said. "You didn't intrude." A pause. "He's not a kind man," Elijah said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said, "he isn't." "Is he the reason you left?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the empty road. "He told me I was worthless," she said, and it was the first time she had said the word out loud to another person, and it sat in the air between them, small and sharp. She felt Elijah go still beside her, and she was aware of him turning to look at her, though she didn't look back. "Worthless," he said, and his voice was careful and deliberate, the way a man's voice is when he is deciding exactly what to say and how. "He has a gift for that kind of thing," she said. "He always has." "Opal," he said, and the use of her first name was new, and she did look at him then because it was new enough that it meant something. "Someone has been telling you a very old lie." She looked at him. The afternoon light was behind him and the prairie stretched out in every direction, and a red-tailed hawk was working the thermals above the north pasture, and he was looking at her with gray-brown eyes that held no pity, which she was grateful for, and a great deal of something else which she was less sure about. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she thought she understood. "I mean that man," he said, "has been telling you something about yourself that is not true. And I think he's been telling it to you so long, and with enough conviction, that you've started to believe it. And I want to tell you clearly, not as your employer and not as anything else I'm not yet entitled to call myself, just as someone who has watched you these past weeks, that you are one of the least worthless people I have ever had the privilege of knowing." She was very still. "You see what needs doing and you do it," he said. "You learned this ranch in 3 weeks. You're teaching school in the autumn because you went and asked for it. You spoke to your father just now with more dignity than most people are capable of in the best of circumstances. You spotted a stone bruise in a horse from across a livery stable floor." She almost laughed at that last one. "The lie," he said, "is about him, not about you. A man who tells his daughter she is worthless is a man who cannot see past his own failures. The failing is entirely his." She stood with that for a long time in the afternoon sun, and something in her chest that had been clenched so long it had started to feel normal began very slowly to ease. "I don't quite believe it yet," she said honestly. "What you're saying." "I know," he said. "That's all right. You don't have to believe it all at once." They stood there a while longer, not touching, not speaking, but in a proximity that had become its own kind of language, and then she turned back to the vegetable garden, and he went back to the work that was waiting, and the afternoon continued on in its ordinary way. But it was not the same afterward, and they both knew it, even if neither of them said so quite yet. Summer on the Kansas prairie in 1883 was a serious thing, hot and bright and relentless, with a sky so wide it made you understand for the first time how large the world actually was. Opal managed the ranch house in the heat with the same methodical capability she brought to everything, and she spent her Sunday afternoons preparing lesson plans for the September school term, sitting at the kitchen table with the door open to catch whatever breeze was available, surrounded by papers, and a particular expression of concentrated focus that Elijah Hale, passing through occasionally on various domestic errands, found himself pausing to observe more often than was strictly necessary. He admitted to himself sometime in late June, falling in love with her. He admitted it to himself in the straightforward, unpanicked way he approached most things, with clear eyes and a willingness to examine the facts. He did not yet know what to do about it, because she was working for him, and he did not want to complicate her situation, and also because she had arrived in his life carrying a wound he had not yet fully understood, and he was not the kind of man who pushed. But he was not immune to her either. He noticed the way she handled the ranch's books when he was behind, sitting down with the ledger like she had always done it, and bringing order to what had been getting unruly. He noticed the way she spoke to the hands, fairly and directly, without condescension, and without the particular trying to be liked quality that made people uncomfortable. He noticed the way she sat on the porch in the evening sometimes, after supper and washing up, when the sky went through its complicated sunset performance, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person learning to be at peace. Gus told him, in the blunt way Gus told him most things, on a July afternoon when they were mending a fence line in the north pasture, "You should tell that woman how you feel." "Mind your business, Gus," Elijah said, without particular heat. "You've been mooning over her since May," Gus said. "It's embarrassing to watch." "I have not been mooning." "You came into the barn singing last Tuesday," Gus said. "I haven't heard you sing since 1879. Elijah pulled a wire taut and said nothing. "She's a good woman," Gus said in a different tone, the sincere one he brought out like good china, rarely and with purpose. "She's a real good woman, Elijah, and she's had it hard, but she's not fragile. I think you'd be surprised what she can hold." Elijah thought about that fence-line conversation for 2 weeks before he acted on it. What moved him to act was a Saturday evening in late July, when a summer thunderstorm came off the prairie with its usual dramatic speed, lightning walking across the sky in the west, and the air going electric and green-smelling. And he came in from the barn to find Opal on the porch watching the storm approach with that expression on her face. Not fear, but something open and receiving, like she was taking it in. He came and stood beside her on the porch, and they watched the lightning together, and the first big drops of rain began to hit the boards of the porch floor, and she said, without preamble, "My mother loved storms. She used to say they were the sky's way of making sure you knew it was alive." He said, "She sounds like she was wonderful." "She was the best person I knew," Opal said. "She worked herself half to death for a man who didn't deserve it, but she never stopped being generous. I used to wonder how she did it, how she kept her heart open." A pause. "I understand better now that I've been away from him for a few months. It wasn't that she couldn't see him clearly. She could. She just chose not to become what he was." The storm was arriving in earnest now, the rain sheeting across the yard, and they were under the porch roof and dry, and the thunder was rolling through in long, satisfying intervals. "Opal," he said. She turned to look at him. In the storm light her green eyes were very clear. "I have been wanting to say something to you for about 2 months," he said. "And I want to say it properly, not in a way that makes you feel any pressure regarding your position here, because your position here is yours entirely regardless of what I say or what you say in response." "All right," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could see something shift in her face, a kind of held breath. "I think you are the most capable and the most honest and the most genuinely good person I have spent sustained time with since my mother," he said. "And I think I am in love with you. And I want to know if there is any possibility that you feel anything similar, or if there is any possibility that you might, given time." The rain was very loud on the porch roof, and the yard was steaming with the sudden wet heat, and the lightning was moving east now, and the thunder was coming close behind. She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. "I have been trying not to feel what I feel about you," she said finally, "because I was not sure I trusted my own judgment about things like this, and also because I was not sure I deserved it." "Opal, let me finish," she said, not unkindly. I was not sure I deserved someone looking at me the way you look at me, because for a long time the person who was supposed to know me best told me that I was not worth looking at. And that gets inside you. It gets inside you in ways you don't fully understand until you're standing on a porch in a thunderstorm trying to tell a good man something true. He waited. The rain fell. What I feel about you, she said carefully, is something I have not felt before, which is frightening partly. But it also feels like standing in this storm feels, which is large and alive, and like something I would be a fool to walk away from. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the rain-loud evening holding hands on the porch of his ranch house, and it was not what anyone would have called a conventional romantic scene, but it was entirely real and it was theirs. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's part of why I trust you." He squeezed her hand gently and she squeezed back, and the storm moved east across the prairie, and they stayed on the porch until it was done. The months that followed were a courtship that was as natural and as organic as anything Opal had ever experienced, which was to say it grew the way things grow on a prairie, steadily and with deep roots. There were evening walks along the fence lines when the light was long and golden. There were shared suppers that grew longer and more conversational. There were Sunday mornings when he came to church with her, because she had begun attending the small Baptist church at the edge of Caldwell, and he sat beside her in the pew with his hat on his knee and his shoulder close to hers. He was patient in a way she had not known men could be patient, not with the restrained impatience of a man waiting for a thing he wants, but with the genuine patience of a man who understood that she was healing something, and that healing took the time it took. There were also setbacks, which were honest and true to the nature of the thing. There was an evening in August when one of the hands made a comment at supper, not malicious, just thoughtless, about women who couldn't make up their minds, and it hit her in a way it shouldn't have because it was adjacent to things her father had said, and she went quiet and stayed quiet, and Elijah noticed but didn't make a scene of it at the table. He found her in the kitchen afterward. "That was thoughtless of him," he said. "He didn't mean anything by it," she said. "Still, I'm fine." "You don't look fine." She turned from the sink and looked at him. "Sometimes things land wrong," she said. "Things that are not actually about me. It's not your fault and it's not really his fault. It's just a thing I'm working through." He nodded. "Is there anything I can do?" "You're already doing it," she said, "by asking." He looked at her for a moment. "Opal, you know you never have to pretend to be more all right than you are. Not here." She looked back at him, and there was something in her chest that ached gently with the kindness of it. "I'm learning that," she said. "Give me a little more time." "You have all the time there is," he said. September arrived and the school term began, and Opal Keene walked into the Caldwell schoolhouse on the first Monday morning with 31 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and a set of lesson plans she had spent the summer building with the same careful attention she gave everything. And she discovered, without surprise but with enormous satisfaction, that she was a good teacher. She was direct and clear, and she expected effort without punishing mistakes, and she had a gift for explaining things in terms a child could reach, which came partly from natural ability and partly from years of being talked down to herself, and knowing exactly what it felt like, and choosing to never do it to anyone smaller. The children liked her. The parents reported this to each other and to the town generally, and even Beaumont at the saloon, whom she saw at a town gathering in October, acknowledged it in a backhanded way that she recognized as the closest he was capable of getting to an apology. "Seems the children are managing all right with a woman teacher," he said. "They are thriving," she said pleasantly, and moved on. Elijah heard this story and made a sound that was the precursor to laughter. By October they were not hiding anything, not that they had exactly been hiding it, but the town of Caldwell had its own opinion economy and people talked, and they talked about Elijah Hale and the schoolteacher who was his housekeeper, and opinions varied along the usual lines. Mrs. Pollitt, when asked about it by the minister's wife, said that it was a fine thing, which closed the subject. Tom Purdy at the feed store told Elijah, with a warmth that was entirely genuine, that he was glad to see him happy. Gus said nothing, but showed up one morning with a bouquet of late-season prairie flowers that he left on the kitchen table, which Opal received with a smile that made him go red to the ears. There was an afternoon in November, after the first hard frost of the year, when they rode out to the south pasture together to check a section of fence that the wind had been working on. The prairie in November was tawny and enormous, and the sky was the particular bright blue of cold, clear days, and they rode side by side, not in a hurry, the horses stepping comfortably on the dry grass. "My father sent a letter," she said. Elijah glanced at her. "What did he say?" "He said the ranch is failing. He said the cattle prices have gone bad and the well is giving him trouble and he needs help." A pause. The wind moved through the grass with a long, low sound. "What do you want to do?" Elijah asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been sitting with it." She was quiet for a moment, watching the horse's ears. "He is still my father, despite everything, and I do not think I am capable of entirely walking away from that, even when I know it would probably be simpler. Walking away from a parent, even a difficult one, is almost never simple," he said. "I'm not going back," she said firmly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going back to live under his roof and hear what he has to say about me every day. That part is decided." "Then what are you considering?" "Sending him some money," she said. "A small amount, and writing to tell him what I think of him and also that I do not hate him, which is true, much as I've tried." "Those two things can coexist," he said. "Can they? You can refuse to forgive someone their treatment of you and still wish them from a distance that they are not destitute," he said. "Those are separate things." She thought about that for a long time while they rode. "I think I love you," she said, which was the first time she had said it directly, and she said it not looking at him, watching the horizon, and her voice was steady but her hands were not quite. She could feel them on the reins. He pulled his horse up and she pulled up beside him, and he turned to look at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on him before, something that was beyond the warmth and the patience and the steady goodness, something deeper and more open. "Say it again," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I love you, Elijah." "I have loved you," he said, "since you told me that bay horse was favoring his left front, and I have been patient about telling you so because you needed the time. And now I am telling you so because you clearly no longer need it." She laughed, and her eyes were bright, and the cold prairie wind was in her hair, and he leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, which was awkward and warm and perfect, and the horses stood cooperatively still because they were both good horses. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard one by Kansas standards, with several significant storms and stretches of cold that kept everyone close to their fires. But the Hale Ranch was well provisioned and well run, and the house that had been functional and joyless the spring before was now genuinely warm, not only in temperature, but in the inhabited, living sense of a home, where people who care for each other move through the same space. Opal wrote to her father in December. She wrote it carefully over several evenings, drafting and revising, because she wanted it to be honest and not cruel, and finding that line required care. She told him that she was well. She told him that she had a life she was proud of and work she found meaningful. She told him that she had loved him her entire childhood and continued to love him in the complicated, unresolved way that you love a person who has hurt you and cannot seem to help it. She told him that what he had said to her in the kitchen on that Tuesday in March was not the truth, and that it had taken her longer than it should have to understand this, and that she hoped he would examine where it had come from, because it had certainly come from somewhere that had nothing to do with her. She enclosed a small amount of money, enough to help but not enough to keep him from needing to help himself. She sent it and then she let it go, because she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that some things can only be offered. They cannot be forced to land. He proposed to her on a Sunday in February 1884, which was the one day of the week she had claimed entirely for herself, and which she had continued to claim even as the lines between her role in the house and the nature of her presence in his life had shifted beyond any professional arrangement. He proposed to her on the front porch after they had come back from church, which the winter had not discouraged them from attending since they had a solid wagon and 2 good horses, and the day was bright and cold, and the world was entirely still in the way that winter Sundays are still, hushed and white and waiting. He had thought about doing it somewhere more dramatic. He had thought about arranging something, a dinner, a gesture. He had ultimately decided that the most honest thing he could do was say what he wanted to say in a place that was already theirs, at a time that already belonged to them without production. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to be my wife. I want this ranch to be yours in every way it is mine, and I want to be with you for the rest of my life, and I want to do it properly, so I am asking you properly. Opal Keene, will you marry me?" She had known it was coming, in the way you know things when you are paying attention to someone you love, by the quality of his silence and the particular way he had held her hand at church. But knowing it was coming did not diminish it, and she stood on the winter porch and felt the full weight of it, not the good weight, the real weight, the weight of a question that mattered. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He had his mother's ring, which his sister Clara had been keeping in Wichita, having retrieved it from the house after their mother passed. It was a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center, and he had written to Clara for it in October, which meant he had been planning this for some time, which she found unspeakably moving when she learned it. She wrote to Mrs. Pollitt that evening with the news, and Mrs. Pollitt's reply arrived within the week, and contained more exclamation marks than she had previously associated with that practical woman. The wedding was in April 1884, which felt right, 1 year after she had arrived in Caldwell on a borrowed mule with a split lip and a carpetbag. The ceremony was at the Baptist church, performed by the minister, attended by Mrs. Pollitt and her boarders and Tom Purdy and his wife and the ranch hands, all 14 of them, scrubbed and in their good shirts, and Gus, who was standing in the front row with an expression of elaborate nonchalance that entirely failed to conceal the fact that he was deeply moved. Elijah Hale came from Wichita for it, a warm and direct woman of 27 who had her brother's gray-brown eyes and a quick smile, and who embraced Opal within 5 minutes of meeting her and said, "Thank God. I have been telling him for years that this ranch needs a good woman in it and that he needs to get on with it." "I've been in it about a year," Opal said. "I know, and the improvement in his letters has been remarkable," Clara said, entirely without embarrassment. Opal wore a dress she and Mrs. Pollitt had made together over the winter, a deep blue wool that was practical enough for a working ranch and beautiful enough for the moment. And she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers, an evergreen that Clara had arranged, because real flowers were not available in April in Kansas, and dried ones were honest and the right choice. She walked to the front of that small church on her own 2 feet with no one giving her away, because she had given herself to this decision and this man, and the minister knew her well enough by then to understand that she would prefer it this way. And Elijah was waiting for her at the altar with an expression that she thought, for the rest of her life, she would never be able to fully describe to anyone because it was entirely private, entirely his, entirely for her. The words they spoke were the standard words, the ones that had been spoken in churches on the frontier for decades, but they meant them with the particular intensity of 2 people who have come to something through difficulty and chosen it with full information. When the minister said the words about keeping and honoring and cherishing, she felt Elijah's hand tighten around hers, and she pressed back, and she understood for the first time, fully and without reservation, that she was not worthless, that she had never been worthless, that the word had been a projection from a man who could not carry his own failures and had needed somewhere to put them, and that she was standing in a church in Caldwell, Kansas, in April of 1884, 24 years old. A school teacher and a ranch wife, and she was exactly enough. They celebrated afterward with a dinner at the ranch that the hands had quietly prepared while the wedding was happening, because Gus had organized it, and told Elijah that under no circumstances was the woman who had been feeding them for a year going to cook at her own wedding supper. There was beef and cornbread, and someone had produced 2 bottles of decent whiskey and 1 bottle of genuine champagne that nobody could explain the provenance of. And Clara gave a toast that was both funny and heartfelt. And Gus raised his glass and said simply, "To the ranch," which everyone understood was not about the ranch at all. The life they built together after the wedding was a real life, which meant it had problems and required effort, and also contained an abundance of ordinary joy that neither of them took for granted, because both of them knew too well what the absence of it felt like. The school term continued, and Opal Keene, now Opal Hale on the marriage certificate but Opal Keene to her students, because that was how they had started, and she felt no need to change it at school, continued to teach those 31 children with the directness and warmth that had made her a success in the position. She applied for the following year's contract in June and received it without opposition. Beaumont did not vote against her. She did not waste energy wondering why. The ranch prospered under the combined management of 2 people who were both capable in their own sphere and who trusted each other in theirs. Elijah made decisions about the cattle with the experience and judgment of 9 years at the work, and Opal managed the house and the accounts and the hands' welfare and the kitchen with the comprehensive capability that had made her remarkable from the start. They talked everything over. They disagreed sometimes, with the frankness of 2 people who respect each other enough to be honest, and they resolved it with the practicality of 2 people who have things to do and cannot afford to nurse grievances. In August of 1884, she received a letter from her father. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Elijah was out at the barn, and she read it twice, and then she sat with it for a while. It was not an apology. Not exactly. Her father was not a man built for apologies in the full sense of the word. But it was something else, something she had not expected, which was a kind of acknowledgement. He wrote that he had read her letter a great many times, which she could picture, his particular stubbornness making him read it again and again until something in it finally got through. He wrote that he had been dealing with the well and that a neighbor had helped him, and things were somewhat better. He wrote that he had thought about what she said, about what he had told her and where it came from. He did not say she was right, but he wrote, in the halting, unpracticed way of a man for whom this kind of writing was physical effort, "I don't know as I've been fair to you. Your mother would say I haven't. I think she'd be right." She sat with this for a long time. She showed it to Elijah that evening, and he read it carefully and gave it back and said, "How do you feel?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Relief some, sadness a lot, something like forgiveness maybe, though that might take longer. Take as long as you need. I'm not going to pretend he's different than he is," she said, "but I think I can be in correspondence with him without it costing me everything if it stays at a distance." "Then keep it at a distance," he said, "on your terms." "On my terms," she agreed. She wrote back to her father. She kept it relatively short and factual, news of the ranch and the school term and the marriage, which he had not known about, and she kept her tone civil and careful and not warm exactly, but not cold either. She was 30% of the way through the process of forgiving him, and she expected it to take years, and she was comfortable with that. The first of their children, a boy, was born in the spring of 1885. They named him Daniel James Hale, James for Elijah's father, and he arrived on a Tuesday in April, delivered by the Caldwell doctor in the bedroom of the ranch house with Clara present, because Clara had come down from Wichita for the event and had proven a great deal more useful than most people in a birthing room, which Opal attributed to her general Hale family competence. Elijah held his son for the first time with an expression that Opal, exhausted and relieved and entirely in love with both of them, watched from the bed, and she thought that this was the thing her father had never understood, that love was not a finite resource that diminished when distributed. That having more things and people you loved did not make any of them worth less. That the opposite was true. She thought about telling her father this. She thought he would not understand it yet. Maybe someday. Daniel James Hale was a healthy and determinedly opinionated infant who grew into an equally healthy and opinionated toddler. He had his father's coloring and his mother's green eyes, which she discovered delighted her unreasonably. He also had, early on, a very clear sense of exactly what he wanted, and a constitutional inability to be deflected from it, which Clara said was entirely his mother's influence, and which Gus said was just the Hale stubborn coming through. Gus, for his part, became Daniel's honorary grandfather with the quiet inevitability of nature. He appeared frequently with small carved wooden horses, and the kind of patient company that good old men give very young children, and Daniel regarded him with the absolute trust of a small person who has correctly assessed that this is a safe person. In 1886, the cattle market had some difficult months, and Elijah spent a significant portion of the spring negotiating with buyers and making adjustments to the size of the herd that he found professionally painful but financially necessary. He managed it with the same clear-eyed pragmatism he brought to everything, and Opal managed the household accounts with a precision that found them additional savings. She presented to him one evening over supper with a matter-of-factness that made him look at her across the table the way he had been looking at her for 3 years and still had not gotten ordinary about. "Where did you find all of this?" he asked, looking at the figures. "The feed supplier in Wichita is cheaper than Purdy by 12% on oats," she said, "and I think we can reduce the order on a few things we're overbought on. And the school board is giving me a small increase this fall, which matters more to our family accounts now than to the household budget." He put the figures down. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "I'm practical," she said. "Those aren't different things," he said. "Not in my accounting." She looked across the table at him and felt the warmth of it, not the desperate, seeking warmth of the first months in Caldwell when she had been looking for evidence that she was worth something, but the settled, deep warmth of a woman who knows her own value and also knows herself loved, which are separate knowings and both necessary. Tom Purdy, when told about the Wichita feed supplier, said, "Well, I'll have to look at my pricing then," without rancor, and did. And in the end, the Hale Ranch continued to use him because he met the price and the business relationship mattered. But the point was that Opal had the conversation and it went well and nobody was the worse for it. The school grew. By 1887, Caldwell was large enough to support a second teacher for the younger children, and Opal worked with the council to hire a young woman from Topeka, named Miss Andrews, who was energetic and capable. And Opal supervised the arrangement with the easy authority of someone who has been doing something well long enough to understand how it works. Beaumont, by 1887, had sold his saloon and moved to Dodge City, where presumably his opinions about women found a different audience. The council replaced him with a dry goods merchant named Holloway, who was a fair-minded and unremarkable man, and Opal's relationship with the school board improved accordingly. Her father came to visit in the summer of 1887, invited by Opal under conditions she had set out in a letter that was clear about what she could offer and what she could not. He came for 3 days. He met Elijah properly, which this time was different than the charged yard confrontation of 1883, because the power arrangement was different and both men knew it. He met Daniel, who was 2 years old and treated his maternal grandfather with the cheerful indifference of a small person who has not yet learned to be nervous about adults, and Clement Keene, faced with his grandson's uncomplicated interest in him, seemed to lose approximately 20 years of his hardness in the course of an afternoon. He said on the last evening of his visit to Opal in the kitchen while she was finishing supper and Elijah had taken Daniel out to see the horses, "You've done well for yourself." "Yes," she said, simply and without apology. "Better than I did," he said. She was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot. "That is probably true," she said. "But I don't need you to say so." He was quiet too, Outside the window she could see Elijah holding Daniel at the corral fence, showing him the horses, and the light was long and amber and the horses were moving slowly in the evening, and it was one of those moments the world makes without announcing it, the kind you carry afterward. "I know I wasn't right by you," her father said. He said it looking at the floor, which was very like him. "No," she said, "you weren't." "I don't know as I can do better than that," he said. "I know," she said. "It's all right." And she meant it, not the all right of someone performing forgiveness, but the all right of someone who has done the work of it over many years and arrived somewhere that is genuinely, if not simply, at peace. It's all right. He left the next morning and she watched the wagon go, and this time she did look back, or rather she looked forward in the direction he had gone, and she felt the complicated, partial resolution of a thing that would never be fully resolved but no longer had the power to define her. Elijah found her on the porch a while after the wagon disappeared. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." He sat beside her and took her hand, and they sat on the porch of their ranch in the summer morning and watched the prairie in comfortable silence, which was, she thought, one of the great luxuries of a good marriage, the silence that does not require filling. A daughter came in the winter of 1888, born in December in the same bedroom where Daniel had arrived, again with Clara present, again with the Caldwell doctor. This time somewhat less urgently needed because Opal had done this before and conducted the business with characteristic efficiency. They named her Mabel Ruth Hale, Ruth for Opal's mother. Elijah held Mabel the way he had held Daniel, with enormous care and an expression that Opal would describe later to Clara as something between awe and terror, which Clara said was exactly correct and to be expected. Daniel, age 3, regarded his sister for a long moment after being introduced, and then said with the directness of a Hale child, "She's very small." "You were also very small," Opal said. "I'm not now," he said with satisfaction. "No," she agreed. "You certainly are not." Gus carved Mabel a small wooden cradle that he left on the porch without fanfare, which was how Gus gave gifts. And Opal found it one morning and brought it inside and felt the warm, familiar ache of being in a place and among people where generosity was ordinary. The schoolhouse in 1889 was expanded to accommodate the growing town, and Opal's position formalized with a longer contract and a better salary that recognized what everyone by then understood, which was that the Caldwell School's improvement over the past 6 years was substantially attributable to its senior teacher. She hired a third teacher in 1890, a young man named Wilson who was fresh from a teacher's college in Ohio, and who treated her with the appropriate respect of someone who has come to work for a person of established competence. The ranch continued to grow and stabilize through the late 1880s, recovering from the cattle market difficulties of the middle of the decade, and finding the kind of steady, reliable prosperity that comes from good management sustained over years. Elijah's reputation in the ranching community around Caldwell was one of the things that pleased Opal most, not because she needed him to be successful, but because she could see how he had built it, through consistent honesty and fair dealing, and the willingness to say what he meant and deliver what he promised. Tom Purdy said, at a merchants' gathering in 1889, "Hale's handshake is worth more than most men's signed paper." And there was a general agreement around the room that nobody contested, and Elijah, when Opal told him this later, looked genuinely embarrassed, which she found entirely endearing. The letter that arrived from her father in the autumn of 1890 was different from the others. She could tell from the handwriting, which was shakier than it had been, and she opened it with a kind of already knowing feeling that settled in her chest before she read a word. He was sick. He wrote it plainly, because Clement Keene was nothing if not plain in his speech, that the doctor in the town nearest his ranch had told him his heart was giving out, and he did not have a great many months ahead of him. He was 68. He had written to tell her because he thought she should know. She sat with the letter for a long time. She went through a complicated sequence of feelings that she had long since learned not to rush, and on the other side of all of them was a clear, calm decision. She went out to the barn where Elijah was working with one of the younger hands on a stubborn piece of tack, and she waited until he noticed her expression and dismissed the hand. "My father is dying," she said. He straightened. "I'm sorry." "I want to go see him," she said. "Once, before he does." "Of course," he said. Without hesitation, without qualification. "It might be nothing," she said. "He might recover, or he might be more dramatic than the reality warrants. He's not entirely above that." "It might be nothing," Elijah agreed, "but you want to go regardless." "I'll take Daniel," she said, because Daniel at 5 was old enough and she thought her father should know his grandchild properly. "I'll manage here," Elijah said. "Clara can come if you want company on the road." "Clara would probably like to see the country," Opal said, with the slight smile that Clara's enthusiasms reliably produced. She went in October, with Daniel and with Clara, and she spent 5 days at her father's ranch, which was smaller and more run-down than she remembered, and also, in the way of places that have mattered to you, somehow more present in memory than in reality. Her father was thinner and quieter than he had been at the summer visit 3 years prior, and the shake in his hands was visible. He sat in the chair in the kitchen, the chair where she had hung her apron on that March morning 7 years ago, and he watched Daniel explore the yard with the careful attention of a man watching a reprieve he had not expected. She did not manufacture a conversation she did not have. She did not pretend to a warmth that was not quite available. But she sat with him in the evenings and talked about practical things, about the ranch and the cattle and what would happen to the property, and she helped with some of the work that had gotten away from him, and she made sure he was eating adequately, and she let him watch Daniel every afternoon. On the last evening of her visit, he said to her, "You turned out all right." It was so vastly inadequate that for a moment she felt the ghost of all the old rage. And then she looked at him, this old man in his kitchen, diminished and unwell and trying in the only way he had ever known how to try, which was very small and very late, and she felt the rage pass through her and leave. "I turned out fine," she said, "in spite of some things and because of others." "Your mother," he said. "Yes," she said, "and myself and some good people who came after." He nodded. He looked at his hands. "I know I wasn't what I should have been," he said. "No," she said, "but you're saying so now, and that has some value." She hugged him when she left, which surprised both of them. He held on for a moment longer than she expected, which surprised her further, and she thought, riding away with Daniel on her knee, and Clara beside her and the October prairie rolling out in every direction, that this was the best that particular story was going to give her, and that it was enough. Clement Keene passed away in January of 1891, and Opal received the news by telegraph from a neighbor, and sat with Elijah in the kitchen of their ranch house in the early morning, and felt the particular grief that comes not from losing someone perfect, but from losing the possibility of more, the closing of a door that had never opened fully and never would now. She cried, which she let herself do without apology or management, and Elijah held her and said nothing, which was exactly right. She took a week away from the school, which the capable Miss Andrews and Mr. Wilson managed perfectly well. She wore black for a month, as was proper. She handled the business of the estate, such as it was, by correspondence, and she made the arrangement that the Keene property should be sold, and the proceeds, modest as they were, should be split between any outstanding debts and a small fund for the Caldwell School Library, which had been in need of books for years. The minister preached a Sunday sermon that spring about the complexity of human imperfection and the strange mercy of time, and she sat in the pew with Elijah's hand around hers and Daniel sitting between them and Mabel on her lap, and she thought about her mother and her father, and the long distance she had traveled since a Tuesday morning in March of 1883, when she had untied her apron and walked out the door. The Caldwell School Library received its donation of books in the summer of 1891, and Opal dedicated them with a small ceremony that the children attended. And she said, to the assembled students, that reading was the most reliable way she knew to discover that your own experience, whatever it was neither unique nor permanent, that other people had been where you had been and found their way to somewhere better, and that the proof was in the pages. Daniel, 6 years old, sat in the front row with the solemn attention of a child who takes school very seriously, which he did, and asked afterward if he could check out the book about horses, which he could. In the years that followed, the Hale Ranch settled into the deep, ongoing rhythms of a well-run, prosperous working ranch, and the Hale family settled into the deep, ongoing rhythms of a family that has built something real. There were hard seasons and there were good seasons, drought years and abundant years, and there were the 10,000 ordinary days that make up the substance of a life, the mornings and the suppers, and the evening hours on the porch when the prairie put on its sunset performance, and the children were in bed, and two people who had found each other in the best possible way sat together in the way of people who are entirely glad of where they are. By 1893, Daniel was 8 and Mabel was 4, and there was a third child, a boy named Thomas Henry Hale, born in the spring, who arrived with the decisive energy of a person who had somewhere to be and was getting there on his own schedule. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and an immediate, obvious personality that Gus said reminded him of a ranch dog he'd once had in the way of being completely certain of his own importance. "That is not a compliment," Elijah told Gus. "That dog was my best ranch dog," Gus said without apology. The school continued to grow, and Opal continued to teach, and the community continued to value her in the concrete way communities value people who are demonstrably good at something important. She was offered a position on the school board itself in 1894, which made her laugh when she received the letter because she thought about that Tuesday a decade ago when she had been dismissed with the suggestion that she focus on what women were naturally suited for. She accepted the position. She served on it effectively for 6 years. The thing she thought about most often, in the quiet moments, in the early mornings when she was up before anyone else and the ranch was still, and the prairie was doing its ordinary beautiful thing in whatever weather the season offered, was the lie. The old lie, as Elijah had called it that afternoon in the yard when her father had come and gone. She thought about how thoroughly she had believed it, not all the way and not without resistance, but enough. She thought about how it had gotten inside her in the years between her mother's death and her departure, worked its way in through the repetition and the authority of the source, the way water works into stone, slowly and with patience, until it has made a change that looks permanent. She thought about how it had taken someone else seeing her clearly and saying so, simply and without fanfare, to begin the process of getting it back out. Not all at once, not the first time he said it, or the second. But over time, over the weight of evidence accumulating against the lie, over the fact of a life being built that the lie said was not possible. She thought that this was what love did when it was the right kind, when it came from someone who was genuinely paying attention. It did not rewrite who you were. It did not install a new story over the old one. It showed you the original, the one that had been true all along before someone who could not carry his own failures had set it aside and put his own version in its place. She sat on the porch one morning in the autumn of 1895, 40 years old, with a cup of coffee and the early light, and the prairie doing something extraordinary with the low sun through the dry grass, and Elijah came out and sat beside her, and she handed him the other cup she had brought out for him because she always did, and they sat in the comfortable quiet of people who have shared a life for more than a decade and found it, in the aggregate, good. "What are you thinking about?" He asked because after 12 years he had learned to ask when she had that particular expression. About how different it could have been, she said. For the worse or the better. For the worse, she said. It could have gone very differently. I could have stayed. She paused. Or I could have come here and not believed you. He looked at her. When you said what you said, she said, about the lie, I could have heard it and not been ready to hear it. It wouldn't have been your fault. I just might not have been ready. You were ready, he said. I was barely ready, she said. It took 2 more years. That's not barely ready, he said. That's right on schedule, she smiled. The prairie was doing something golden in the early light, the whole enormous sweep of it, and the horses were moving in the far corral, and somewhere in the barn Daniel had started a conversation with Gus that she could hear faintly in the morning air, the high voice of a 10-year-old and the low gravel voice of an old man. And inside the house Mabel was getting up and Thomas was still asleep because Thomas slept like he did everything with full commitment. "I'm glad I was ready," she said. "So am I," he said. He reached over and took her hand, and she held it the way she had been holding it for 12 years, like something worth holding on to. The ranch went on. The children grew. Daniel at 15 was already working the cattle beside his father with a competence that made Elijah privately enormous with pride and publicly matter-of-fact about, because he was that kind of father. Mabel was in the schoolhouse with her mother, not in her mother's class but at the school where her mother taught, and she had her mother's precision of thought and her father's patience, and was going to be, Opal thought, someone remarkable in ways she hadn't yet imagined. Thomas at 7 was loud and funny and entirely certain of himself, and everyone in the ranch loved him without reservation, which he accepted as his due. Gus, in 1898, retired from the heavy work of ranching, as a man in his late 60s must, and Elijah built him a small additional room on the north side of the house, because Gus had no family to go to, and the Hale Ranch was as close to home as anything else. And Gus sat in his room in the evenings and carved wooden things for the children, and told them stories about the cattle drives of the 1870s that were probably 60% accurate and 100% entertaining. When he died in the winter of 1901, quietly in his sleep in his room, he left behind 3 carved horses on the shelf, a carved wooden schoolhouse, and a reputation for being the finest ranch hand in the area. And Elijah stood at the graveside in the cold and said a few words that were brief and honest and entirely sufficient. And Opal stood beside him with her hand through his arm and the 3 children beside her. And Thomas, who was 11 now, was old enough to feel the real weight of it and cried with the uncomplicated openness of someone who has not yet learned to manage grief into acceptable sizes. She held him afterward and said, "It's all right to cry. It means you loved him." "I did love him," Thomas said. "So did we all," she said, "and that doesn't go away." The town of Caldwell in the early years of the 20th century was a different town than the one she had ridden into on a borrowed mule in the spring of 1883. Bigger and more settled and somewhat less wild, the cattle drives having diminished as the railroad spread, and the open range was broken up by fences. But it was still the prairie and still the West, and still recognizably the place that had given her a room and work, and a future when she had arrived with $1.40, and the stubborn determination not to be what her father had named her. She walked down the main street of Caldwell one morning in the spring of 1902 and looked at the town and felt the full, quiet satisfaction of someone who is exactly where she is supposed to be. She had come a long way, not in miles, though there were those, in the other kind of distance. She had a life of her own making, built with her own hands alongside a good man who had loved her clearly and said so, and had never, not once in the 18 years she had known him, looked at her like she was furniture he had tired of. She had a school full of children who were learning things that would open the world to them. She had a ranch that was solid and well run, and hers in every way that mattered. She had 3 children who were growing into themselves with all the particular energy and contradiction that entailed. She had friends, real ones, Mrs. Pollitt who still wrote letters, Clara who came every summer from Wichita, people in the town who knew her and regarded her with the warmth that is earned rather than assumed. She had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's generosity, and she had added to those things, over many years of deliberate work, her own particular version of peace. The lie was gone. Not gone the way a scar goes, because some things leave marks that stay, but gone the way an infection goes when the body has finally, fully fought it off, gone in the sense that it had no more power, that she could hold the memory of it without being held by it, that she knew exactly what it was and where it had come from, and that it had never, not for a single day of her life, been true. She was Opal Keene, who had become Opal Hale, who had come to Caldwell on a borrowed mule with nothing, and had built something from nothing the way people do when they are paying attention to what is real. She was a woman who could spot a stone bruise in a horse from across a stable and make biscuits better than Mrs. Conaway and teach 31 children the difference between nouns and verbs, and sit on a porch in the autumn morning with her husband and feel, all the way down to the ground, that she was worth every bit of the life she was living. She walked back to the ranch through the prairie morning, the sky enormous and blue in every direction, the grass beginning to green up for another spring, and she thought of all the springs before this one and all the springs that were coming, and she felt something she recognized, after much practice, as gratitude, not the desperate grateful of someone who has narrowly escaped something, but the deep-rooted grateful of someone who is here, entirely and undeniably here, and knows it and is glad. Elijah was at the corral when she came back, working with a young horse, a gray this time, who was testing his patience in the way young horses do, and he looked up when he heard her on the road and raised one hand in the easy greeting of a man who is glad to see someone come home. She raised her hand back. She came through the gate and across the yard, and the gray horse regarded her with rolling eyes, and she spoke to it quietly, one hand out, and it calmed, because she had always had that way with horses, and Elijah was watching her with that look, the one she had never been able to describe to Clara and had long since stopped trying to, the one that was entirely private and entirely hers. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He was smiling. He had been smiling at her in one way or another for 18 years. The gray horse put its nose in her palm and breathed out and was still, and the spring morning went on around them, and everything was, in every way that mattered, exactly as it should be.